Welcome to part 5 of the American Revolution. Now we're going to take a look at war objectives. Now, as I've said before, you can really measure the success in warfare based on whether or not you achieve your war objectives, right? And at the start of this war, the British have a pretty tremendous advantage as far as fighting the war itself goes, right? They, for one, manufacturing. They out-manufactured the colonies by a wide margin, and it makes sense when you think about it. Remember, the entire British economic policy was to use their colonies as sources of raw materials to come back to British industries to make finished products that are then sold back to the colonies, right? So they're manufacturing tons of rifles and bullets and gunpowder. They have all these mills and manufacturing facilities. While in the colonies, you do have manufacturing, but just not on the same scale. In fact, for one example, in the colonies, there's not a single place that produces large amounts or significant amounts of gunpowder, right? All gunpowder is being imported. That's kind of important in warfare. The British also had an advantage in battlefield experience, right? They had fought the 7 Years' War prior, right? And that war was a global war. They had fought it everywhere. And so they have a lot of officers that have extensive battlefield experience. As a matter of fact, one of them we'll talk about, Charles Cornwallis, had come from India. He had fought there during the 7 Years' War. Okay. And then there's the issue of the Royal Navy, the most powerful navy in the world. As long as British troops were near the sea, they had a tremendous advantage over anyone they were fighting because a few things. One, they could use the Royal Navy for, quote, artillery support, right, bombardment, and they could also use it for supply or escape if necessary, right? And then finally, money. The British economy was significantly larger than that of the colonies, right? The GDP adjusted to, approximate current dollars would put England's GDP at approximately 10.32 trillion American dollars today, compared to only about 3 trillion for the colonists, right? So there's a lot more money that can be spent. Despite the fact that Britain has a lot of debt, they also have a lot of power to incur more. Now, that's not to say that the colonists didn't have advantages of their own. Of course, the biggest one's probably home field advantage, right? They're fighting on their home turf. So that means they know the lay of the land really well. So they know things like you don't go through this passageway at this time of year because the rains turn into a muddy bog and your cannon will sink in the mud. Or, just little ways that are quicker to get to one place or the other. Or you know where this town is, right? You don't have to have a map to find it. These kind of things, right? That's a pretty big advantage. Also, you have logistics and numbers. I mean, the British have a larger population to bring to bear, but they got to bring it over, whereas the colonists can recruit locally, right? That kind of ties into that home field advantage a bit as well. Tactics. The British Army is designed to fight other European armies. It's designed to fight these set-piece battles with, skirmishing lines and things like that, where the colonists, well, for the most part, just don't have the training to fight that way, so they're going to fight any way they can, which is going to be guerrilla warfare at best, right? And so the British Army is not really designed to fight this type of battle. And then finally, you got purpose, right? The colonists are fighting to protect their homes, right? They know, like, you could be fighting this battle knowing that if you lose this, you're going to have regulars rolling into your hometown where your wife and where your kids are, right? That's going to be a little bit more of a motivation. Whereas the British soldier, he's probably fighting for king and country, but he's also fighting for a paycheck. And because the British are going to spend wealth to fight this war, they are going to hire a lot of mercenaries to do fighting for them, and these guys are fighting exclusively for a paycheck. And finally, and most importantly, the colonists were in a position where they didn't have to win. They only had to make sure that they didn't lose, right? As I mentioned before, war objectives are important. The British war objectives were to basically subjugate the colonies, right? Even if you have to do them one at a time, you need to conquer them. You need to defeat their armies. You need to capture their leadership. Whereas the colonial war objectives were simply this. 1, don't lose. Maintain some form of army in the field. right? You don't have to beat the British Army. Matter of fact, it's not realistic to think that these little militias are going to beat the powerful British Army. But you don't have to beat them. You have to just not lose to them. That's number one. Number two, break their will to fight. Make them want to make their population turn against the war. Make them ask, what is the point of this? Why are we doing this? And then finally, get some help, right? And that's why they're going to be courting France, right? Another major power. Try and get them involved and support this. So those are your three war objectives for the colonists, and they're a lot easier to obtain. When we take a look at this historically, we see other examples of this. For example, Vietnam. The Vietnamese and the NLF, the National Liberation Front, often referred to as the Viet Cong, didn't have to beat the United States Army, and it wasn't realistic to think that they could. All they had to do is, one, keep fighting. Don't lose. You're not going to beat them, but don't lose to them, right? Don't be destroyed. Get help in this case, north of Vietnam, right? And break the American will to fight, which they did. They obtained those three objectives, and therefore, ultimately, you end up with a unified Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. Okay. Another example of it where it didn't work out is the Civil War, which we, of course, talk about later in this course. The Confederacy's war objectives were the same thing, too. Maintain an army in the field, get some help, and break the northern will to fight, and they will fail on those points.